Thank you, Anne. And it's wonderful to see so many welcoming and friendly faces in the audience. And if this is the audience that's watching it later, if you have any questions or comments, please feel free to reach out to any of the authors on the paper at any time. So I'm going to get us started here with our presentation, as Anne mentioned the title. And this is a collaboration between a number of authors here on our campus. So myself and Cara, Dan, Shauna, Mabel, Deb, who's here today, Grace, and Avery. And we'll have parts where actually we'll ask other authors to talk about our paper. And this was actually published in a Journal of Community Engagement and Scholarship. So this is a published paper. If you would like a copy of it, you can let us know and we will send it to you. Here's our motivation for this paper. It says, when COVID-19 emerged, university operations, including community engaged scholar teaching and research, had to pivot. The conversation was no longer about sustaining community engagement, but about enduring the pandemic for the sake of students, faculty, and community. And this work collected data about community engaged planned activities during the spring and summer of 2020, so in our first year of the pandemic. And it was from faculty researchers, instructors, and our community partners to reveal insights about the experience, adaptation, and innovations for reimagining community engagement sustainability going forward. So here's our outline. And I did leave on here so that the switch ups of our author or presentation. So Cara is going to tell us more about UW-Bothell and our community engagement activities before the pandemic, and then we'll talk about this study and where we've come to today. And I'll talk about more of the research design. And then we'll share some of our insights. We'll also, as I said, bring in some of our authors and talk about some conclusions, and then open it up also to our audience to share some of their own stories about the pivot of COVID and also Q&A. So I'll turn it over to Cara.
Thanks, Deanna. So just to remind us all, the pre-pandemic world of community engagement, here are some snapshots of work that faculty and partners and students were doing at UW-Bothell. We had nursing students working with the Bellevue Fire Department, doing public health outreach and survey development work for the Bellevue Fire Department. We had mapping communities classes presenting in the Redmond Council Chambers room, some of their mapping discoveries that they found as we walked around the city of Redmond, and had a great final presentation. We had, over the previous summers, an Operation Management certificate with the Muckleshoot Tribal College. Here are those students engaged with each other with pens in a classroom, brainstorming their different projects that they were going to implement. And then we have our space public outreach team, which has been ongoing undergraduate students delivering information about science to K through 12 students in the schools and doing that public outreach. So you can see these are just a snapshot, but engaging us in this right before the pandemic hit, what our students were engaged in the community, with other students on site in community spaces.
Now that we talk about entering the pandemic. So this was spring of 2020. And right away, we started hearing, about community engagement, the challenges that were being faced by the instructors, by researchers, and by our partners. And then very quickly after the pandemic started, though, right during spring quarter, we started to hear about some innovations, like how can we bring back community engagement? What can we do over summer, over fall? And so this was really kind of our motivation for capturing this moment for us here at UW-Bothell, but then also trying to bring out the insights of how the pivot was made to work for us and what we learned, so that we can share it out to ourselves, but also to other institutions where community engagement is such a big part of our academic program. So working with my colleagues, to give a shout out to Dan Bustillos as one of our co-authors who does a lot of work in disaster research. And he helped bring in a lot of the literature around disaster framing and how people react to disasters, but also can be innovative in disasters, post-disaster. And we talked about, so how do we want to best capture this? And so in the literature, we talk about sense making. So in our own words, can we make sense of what is going on? So the stories of how we pivoted, how we experienced the situation. And then it's not just hearing it, but also translating how we're hearing it, what we're hearing into actions for the future. And this brings about this idea of reflexivity. It's the extent to which we can collectively reflect about what we were trying to do, about our objectives and strategies and processes, identify our frustrations, which of course during the pandemic we had many, but then also to think about how we want to move forward in the solutions that we found. So as it says at the bottom, together through sense making and reflexivity, we cope. And I think a lot of our answers to some extent talk about coping. So we hear a lot about the frustrations of dealing with the pandemic, but then also to capture change and take stock of our innovations. And then we can develop a greater sense of our cohesive identity that we are part of one unit here at UW-Bothell that is very involved and committed to community engagement. So we had 3 research questions that we developed for this study. So the first one was, what was the experience of the faculty, researchers, instructors, and community partners for the planned activities of spring and summer? Then, so that was experience. The next one is strategies, and the third one is innovation. So the second one, what are the strategies that were relevant to the researchers, instructors, and community partners in spring and summer? And then finally, what innovations were relevant to the researchers, instructors, and partners during spring and summer? All right, so I think first place to kind of get us in the context of how community engagement changed and pivoted, I'm going to turn it back to Cara to tell us about how courses were planned and then how they ended up happening depending on kind of what was their basis of community engagement.
Thanks, Deanna. So you're looking at 2 graphs here of both spring and summer. And in spring 2020, we had 29 what we call community-based learning and research courses that were planned, that faculty had set community partners matched with their courses. And through spring, the pandemic started at the beginning, and through the end, we had 14 courses that actualized. So about half were canceled and half continued. And we'll talk about those continued courses as well. In summer, we had 11 planned and 11 actualized. So this is an interesting kind of bounce back of the same amount of courses that were planned, ran, how fast our faculty and partners are able to adapt to be thinking ahead towards their summer courses. If we go to next slide, we'll talk a little bit more about the nuances of these classes. Within community-based learning and research, we use 2 terminology, placement-based and project-based. Placement-based typically means that students and faculty at one point in the quarter are engaged actually physically in the place of where a community partner is working or where their constituents are engaged or land, maybe an environmental place, a restoration site. But students are actually engaged in a place doing their research, doing their community engagement work for their learning. Project-based is students, a partner pitches a project to a whole class, and it could also have a place-based component where students are engaged in a project and they're also going to the partnership site to collect information, or a project could be fully remote that a partner is pitching that to the whole class. So you'll see here, we had 12 planned at the beginning of spring for placement-based, and 10 of those classes were canceled, and 2 were able to pivot and run as a project-based course. We had 17 project-based courses planned, 5 of those were canceled, and 12 were able to remain as a project-based community-based learning course. So that's the breakdown. And for summer, you'll see we had 2 planned for placement. I think the interesting thing is here is those 2 were able to pivot with enough time in the quarter to run as a project-based course. So those 11 courses continued. So Deanna just highlighted this red box up top. Kind of a takeaway from this slide is the placement-based courses are more susceptible to the pandemic, and for obvious reasons of what the type of disaster this was that we were encountering, and the project-based courses were more resilient to this type of disaster.
All right, so I'm going to jump in and tell you specifically about our study. So we collected data. We ran our procedure through the Human Subjects Review Board of our IRB, and we're approved to run this survey. And we collected some quantitative information on a survey scale, but then also a lot of our research is based on qualitative answers from our respondents. So this shows you, we really quickly threw together this plan to capture what we thought was going to be a short little pandemic. And we thought, oh, we better get in there and capture data. And now, we're still kind of continuing to come out of the pandemic. But in July and August, we prepared our study. In September, we had it approved, and we were running data collection in October through November. And we first started to begin to write up and analyze our data in late December and January. So we had 22 teaching faculty, 6 research faculty, 13 partners for a total of 41 respondents, which is pretty solid response rate given how many teaching faculty and partners we have. And then interestingly, of the faculty that responded, so 4 of them had teaching or research canceled, community-based teaching and research. 10 proceeded with the same partner, 10 with a different partner, 2 without a partner, and then 2 didn't provide a response of how they were. So here's that quantitative piece of the survey. So we asked faculty, specifically just the faculty, how they felt, how satisfied they were with the following information. So 4 questions. How satisfied were they with their strategies that they employed to meet the needs of the community partner? How about their strategies needed to meet students? How about just their community engagement experience? And then the innovation and community engagement that emerged. So how satisfied were they? And then the last one is kind of interesting as well, is will you make permanent changes to your community engagement based on your experience? And so we have the reports from the faculty of what was reported. And so just a couple of takeaways before we get into the qualitative piece of the survey, but faculty were mostly satisfied with their strategies. So we have more of the respondents were in the neutral to very much for strategies employed for community partners and for students. And then interestingly, about half of our faculty, there were 21, but about 10 in the false and 11 in the true, said that they would make permanent changes to their course. So actually one of the questions we've had, and Cara and I have talked about this, is to go back to faculty and ask about how about now? How have things changed? Are you still making these changes? Are you making new changes? So this has prompted some new research questions. Now, in terms of the qualitative data, a subgroup of our researchers, our authors, worked together to develop and reading all of the responses to come up with themes that were part of the responses. And we focused we wanted to map them to our research questions. And so we have here, this second column tells us, how these themes map to our different research questions about adapting during the pandemic, sustaining, or experiencing the pandemic. And then we have our different thematic codes. So we had action strategies being applied by the faculty, such examples as reshaping our objectives slightly, or first and foremost was reworking the syllabi. Communication strategies, so being frank with students and with partners, and that there will be lots of trial and error. Collaborative resilience, so this is more about how the partner and the faculty were working together to make sure that the partnership would sustain throughout and after the pandemic. So we have some examples here. We have much longer examples to come, so I don't want to read all of these, but these are in the paper. And then we had loss and challenge, which I will say was the most prominent of the codes that we found. And this is in part because of probably when we were collecting this data, if you think about in October and November of 2020. And also, I think this really shows that our survey also kind of served as a coping mechanism. A lot of the stories were about how hard it had been to think about community engagement, whether or not it was happening for them, and how it was kind of this missed experience for the faculty, for partners, and for students. And then there was some conversation about future uncertainty, about what are things going to look like post-pandemic. Student considerations. So of course, as faculty and as partners, the students are really, really central to the community engagement experience. So there was a lot of talk about how the engagement would pivot or change for students. And then of course, with our pivot, a lot of our work became on Zoom. And so technology was also a focal point in a lot of the responses. And not always bad. So it had its good moments and its bad moments in terms of the use of technology. All right, so we have a few examples. Car, would you like to talk us through these? And then we'll bring in our couple of authors.
Yes, this is some of our qualitative quotes that came directly from faculty or partners that took our survey. One of our main themes was loss and challenges, as Deanna described, and this is a human-centered design faculty member at UW-Bothell said, having to be remote dramatically reduced our ability for students to observe the partners doing their normal work in their normal places of work. That eliminated a key source of data that is at the center of what it means to do robust human-centered design. So just the initial kind of shift of pedagogy of faculty that are used to having students reflect upon a place and a space of learning for their community engaged work in their class. Then this one is the other theme, collaborative resilience. And this is from a community partner voice who said, we paused on community engagement with the university to set a foundation for successful online learning. 2 quarters into online learning, our organization is ready to bring the university back and merge into virtual partnership with various job descriptions, online orientation and training and projects. So it just shows the resilience and creativity and collaboration on the community partner side that took, this would have been then an engagement in autumn. After spring and summer, the partners ready to engage the university again in a virtual community engagement way. So really that joint faculty, partner, and university collaboration we saw a lot of. Then this was a slide actually in autumn that we shared with the Community Engagement Council just to show the burst of community engagement inspiration that happened over summer and some of the courses that were planned to be in person. So this top one with LETI, Latino Education Training Institute, Dr. Reza DeSmit was going to have an in-person potluck with her students, UW-Bothell students, and then LETI was running a women's writing class. And those students together were going to have a potluck in person. They did an incredible virtual potluck where the students and the women in this writing class created meals at home, and then they were eating them together over Zoom, sharing the recipes, sharing photos, and still really building relationships with each other remotely. So that was incredible. When you think of potluck, you think you are smelling and touching the food, and to translate that to remote partnership space. There was also our Global Initiatives Office pivoted and worked with Prava. We had students doing study abroad virtual internships. And that was a new collaboration that took off through the pandemic. We had educational studies students actually doing community-based research with North Shore School District, nursing students, population health nursing students, working with North Shore School District, researching the impact of COVID on reopening K-12 schools. And then we had educational studies students in the bottom left, working with Washington State Parks, thinking about online learning materials that can be converted into app that children could use to explore the parks that summer and beyond. And then the bottom right is Dr. Jeff Jensen's Salmon Watchers program. And I love this picture of even the students are still out. This is a more elementary student, but with masks out in environment. So by then in the summer, they had started to adapt some policies of safety where people could be together outside with safe protocols. So community engagement continued and it adapted and it thrived in ways that were neat to see over the summer.
All right, so there are many more quotes. We actually have some in case we have time for them. We can bring them in, but we want to get to kind of the rest of the paper here before we open it up a little bit further. So as part of our research, it was not just a reflection, right? We wanted to think about how to move forward, right? What are action items that might be takeaways for us, but also for other institutions? So we have some practical implications, 4 of them, and really kind of using the information and the guidance from what was said from all the respondents to motivate and derive these different implications. So the first one may seem obvious, but it is, moving forward is to have a community engagement emergency management plan. So to emphasize empowering action strategies. So some of the quotes that we took away, those that could take action right away, of pivoting, of making decisions. They didn't have to wait for certain approvals or third parties. They could take action and could actually reframe their courses right away. And then also certain types of partnerships, as we saw with the placement-based versus partner-based or project-based, could pivot more easily or still continue to happen. So, and we're not saying that, suggesting that all types of community engagements should move in one direction or the other, but it is good to have maybe a diversification of different types of community engagements, and then also recognizing how to maybe move fluidly from one type to another if possible. And then second of all, obviously to act with sympathy to the lost experience. So not only in this paper and through our responses, but also, as you may know, so we have had a community engagement council that was comprised of faculty and staff, students, and community partners. And that served as a platform that we really, we spent at least one whole meeting and then parts of other meetings in 2020 listening to our community partners and the challenges that they were facing because of the pandemic. And so having those spaces, such as in those meetings early on, and then with this survey later, provided a way that we could share out the grief, the anxiety, the sorrow of the situation, but we could also kind of move past it and hear about what was working for folks, what they needed, and what could be provided. So, this, as I said, is telling us that, as if we can set up ways to make sure that that coping can happen, then we have this approach that can help us through any pandemic. All right, Cara, you want to take the next couple?
And Deanna, actually, can you go back just to chime in on a diversification? I'm hearing Dan Bustillos, another co-author, his voice studying disasters. He kept reminding us that a cybersecurity disaster could happen in the future, and that then placement-based work would be the most resilient because we wouldn't have access to the internet or that connectivity. So it was a good kind of reminder of different disasters would cause different scenarios for resilience of different types of community engagement. So just wanted to bring that voice in that he was sharing with our author group. Practical implications. So be flexible with the partner's needs in changing situations. Our partners and our faculty were incredibly demonstrated this flexibility, and just to echo that, and that came through in the data in the survey. And then also the ad hoc and timely responsiveness over bureaucracy and rule following. So kind of just like that nimbleness and responsiveness that both our institution and individuals can be. Prioritizing enduring relationships with the partner. We also saw that a lot of classes that were canceled, the faculty and the partner was still in strong communication through that cancelization, or remained in partnership, even not through a research or a teaching project. The faculty and partner were still connected. Also, some of these faculty had longstanding partners before the disaster happened, and because of that strong foundation of the base of the relationship, they were able to pivot faster. So some of those are some things we saw in the nuances of prioritizing the relationship with the partner. Faculty repeatedly spoke of their connections with the partner. There was a sense of trust. That trust had been built over time and through the pandemic. And we also heard some faculty say they'll renew their partnership after the pandemic, but we have that trust that if we pause for a while, it's okay, we'll come back and be renewed as well. Now we want to invite Deb Hathaway, who's here as a co-partner, to share. She was teaching in spring as this was happening, and I want to share some of her case studies as a co-author for this work.
Thank you. So I think one of the things that was interesting for me was going into spring, I had planned a class that was a collaboration performance class. So definitely not one that you would immediately think translates well to a synchronous online environment, really, because it was built around me working with a partner, the Alyssa Burnett Center, to create a collaborative drama class between the two groups. And what was really interesting was, at first I felt I really wanted to try. I think I had a lot of energy, especially in going into spring. I had a lot of energy around, let's try it. Let's see what can work. Let's, try to utilize the resources we have. And I did some, connection out with my partner to see, oh, is there a way for us to make this work at all? And at first there was a trust built there, but there was a little bit of hesitation around, will it, or do we have the resources or like the ability to create something like this? And so I actually started running my class at the very beginning of the quarter, I think the first 3 weeks, without the partnership being a part of it. But we continued that conversation earlier on in the quarter just to kind of maintain that as a potential. And it's sort of as my partner was working to sort of get off the ground what their virtual class offerings would be, there was sort of a connection between the two of us that said, let's try it, let's put out there, let's see if families are interested in this, because we kind of kept that discussion going early on. And so I think, again, like within the first couple weeks of the class, it wasn't actually going to get started, but I think in week 3, we were able to put together some students that had some interest from my partner with my class. And so we got started a little bit later in the quarter, but going back to the implications, part of what really was helpful for me was, again, that established trust, and that we were able to hold those conversations early on and speak to, how are you feeling? Is this something that you would be interested in doing? Can I support you in that? Maybe, and me also knowing some of the students that were having taught them previously at the Alyssa Burnett Center, being able to sort of mention, oh, is this something that this particular student or family might be interested in as well? Should we reach out to them directly? To be able to have those kinds of conversations with that partnership level and that kind of sense of community built a little bit. There was a little bit of also, sense of loss over, it was a theater class and it was meant to be in person and it was meant to have all these elements of connection and being in community and space together. But I think that we really worked hard to kind of see what we could create together. And I think the students also came with a lot of flexibility and excitement around, like, let's try it, let's see how it works, let's try to create a theater play on Zoom and see what happens with it, and let's wear costumes and put on makeup and that space, and sort of like that energy around how do we bring some enthusiasm to it as well. So I think those were 2 really big pieces for me, were sort of like maintaining that conversation, of course, letting go a little bit of what it was the previous time we did it and sort of acknowledging that it was going to be different, but also kind of giving a little bit of space and flexibility and utilizing the technology in a way that was, kind of new and fun and different. How we use backgrounds or what kind of things we could incorporate to make that performance come alive. So I also credit an earlier conversation I had with Natalia Deborah, who's the director of what is your global initiatives, I believe, who we were sharing a conversation around COIL classes earlier, because I felt like, to me, that was in some ways there was a compatibility around like space and time and utilizing technology as a way to bring groups together in an online setting. And so there was a real kind of incentive for me to say, like, let's try it and see what happens, and let's think about how to use that space. So that was kind of a little bit of an overview of what my experience was like getting things together. But then interestingly enough, I've had similar different experiences with other partners where there was that element too of, we just can't do it right now, but we have that trust to like come back to working on this partnership later. And this was a kind of different instance. And then, moving forward too, there was a little bit more, I've done the class a second time in that kind of space. And so it was obviously easier that time to sort of have a lot more forethought into what we were going to do and how we were going to plan it out together.
Thanks, Deb. Such a rich experience. So interesting to hear. All right, we have one more slide to wrap it up, and then we'll open it up for conversation. So there are takeaways. And I will say, like, a lot of our author meetings, we're actually like talking through like what we're each experiencing. And so it was also kind of fun in that we are so interdisciplinary and had such different classes. So it was interesting to hear what was going on in different schools. So the key takeaways from our paper and our research was we learned about ourselves, right? And part of sense making is making sense of what is going on in your context. We were or were not capable of changing. We figured out what we could and could not change for community engagement during the pandemic. And I think we would say that we found that we were more innovative than we ever thought we could be. We showed adaptation and resilience in our practices, and that helped us back then 2 years ago. That helps us to this day. And I think we could say that many of our partners are still our partners and are back working with us again. And then we provide practical insights as a pathway for others, right? So this is one of the reasons we wanted to disseminate this work, is that although it was a sense-making project for us, we learned from it, we suggested some strategies, and we're hoping that other universities can take up this work as well. Interestingly, at the time, there was very few other papers published on community engagement and disasters in particular. And then there was only, I think, one other paper that had even come out so far about community engagement during COVID. So we were very early on in getting this work out there, and we're hoping that others will build off of it and perhaps even do just sense making for themselves, because it was really interesting and helpful. So what we want to do now, we have about 10 minutes left, so I'll stop sharing so we can get everyone back on the screen. This is an opportunity, and I actually did have it on kind of at the end, is to say that, you know, as I mentioned, we all got to be part of this research, and so we all got to share our experiences. And I look at this group, and I know a lot of you do community engaged work of some sort. And so we'd love to hear from you if you want to contribute, like your experience, the challenges, the innovations you saw during COVID, from your own community engagement work, or if you have a question for us, we'll take it. Or I'll call on somebody.
Well, this is definitely a timely topic, because I run a project-based course every year, actually multiple of those engagements. And this is in April, for the first time, I was back in person in class. And I don't have words to express how I felt. When I was doing it online, I thought I was doing great. Of course, my evals are fine, everything is fine. When I actually went back in the class, face to face with my student teams working on community engagement, the joy that I didn't realize the loss until I got it back. So I think part of community engagement based project is not so much about the academic. I've been doing this for 15 years on this campus and 5 years before that. And one of the consistent things that I've always felt in my academic career when I've done these projects with students is that the learning does not necessarily happen through the academic content that we do. I think it's the bonding that happens. And those are intangible factors that are harder to measure, but that's what leads to, I think, student success, or actually, I like to think faculty success. I learn so much as I interact with students. So that comment from the faculty in human-centered design, it speaks to me a lot, because if I cannot observe my cohort, my environment in which this is happening, there is, something's missing. So this was a nice work to everyone. Thank you for doing this.
Thanks, Surya. And I want to thank the co-author team. It was this very multidisciplinary project, and it really took all of us to get this wrapped together and the insights. So thank you, everyone. Cara, do you want to say any last words?
I think that's all. Just thank you. Thanks for your comments and contributing from your perspective of the institution for those that did just right now. Thank you.